Hey guys, so today I wanted to walk you through the 10-mark question for AQA Economics Paper 3. So we'll start with timings, exam technique for this question, the structure, and then we'll go into a couple of examples, one from AQA and one from myself. So the 10-mark question, what is it? It's a data response question. It's asking, it kind of gives a question or a statement. So it says, do you consider that the UK manufacturing sector has been declining? And it asks you to either agree or disagree by using the data. Another one says, do we think that reliance on fossil fuels is falling? And we either agree or disagree using the data. So the timings for this question is, if we're going to take up to 20 minutes, the less time you take, the better, but up to 20 minutes. The structure, a very short introduction, skip it if you're short on time, but introduction would be good. 3 paragraphs at least, maybe 4, and a short conclusion will be necessary. So what you need to do is you basically need to start by writing the key definitions if any of them are necessary. So for example, in this question, I would define or describe macro stability. Now, you don't have to have a perfect word for word definition, but you need to show that you understand what macro stability means. Macro stability might mean referring to limited trade-offs between the 4 objectives, or achieving both economic growth and stable price levels and low unemployment. So something like that. You should be able to describe that human capital refers to workers' skills and knowledge and health. And the other thing I might try to do in my introduction is say what information you'd want if I wanted to answer that question. So I would want data on the UK and Brazil's levels of unemployment, inflation, economic growth, skills, and so on. Okay? We need at least 3 paragraphs. Each of them, we should basically read the data, understand the data, and try to decide if we overall agree or disagree. And then let's just stick to one. So in this one, for example, I would say, I agree with the fact that manufacturing has declined. This is because data, blah, blah, blah. And we're going to go through examples. We're going to do that 3 times. And at the end of each paragraph, we're going to say our limitations, say the limitations of the data. So the data, however, is not complete. We can't get a full picture of changes in inflation. We can't get a full picture of something, blah, blah, blah. Okay? And then a conclusion. So overall, it should be balanced, but you give your opinion. So we can say overall, the data suggests that the UK manufacturing sector has declined. However, it would have been better to have data on blah, blah, blah. Or however, there is a chance that the UK manufacturing sector has been improving because, and it gives a bit of balance. Okay. So the paragraph should give your argument. I agree or I disagree, or the data supports blah, blah, blah. Reference which part of the data you're looking at. I'll go through some examples in a minute. Analyze the data. So if you can do a quick calculation, a percentage change or anything like that, do it. But more importantly, analyze the link between the data and the concept. So don't just say the data shows unemployment increased. So if you say unemployment increased, this shows that more people are out of work, therefore they have lower incomes, therefore their living standard, something like that. Okay, depends on the question. And then explain the limitations of just relying on that data. So not saying that the data is wrong, saying that the data is limited because it's not factoring in inflation, it's not factoring in the population, or so on and so on. So this question here from the specimen paper says, how does Brazil compare with the UK in relation to human capital and macro stability? So first thing I'd do is I'd look at the extracts, the data in the extracts. It's just one piece for this question. And we just want to pick like the 3 or 4 easiest things. Okay, so we've got human capital and macro stability. So we definitely want to look at GDP or GDP per capita, so that could be 1. We want to look at inflation. That's definitely going to suggest which one has more stability. And then the question also mentioned human capital, so something to do with skill level, so literacy rate and years of schooling. That should be plenty. And then if we want more, we can do. But for this question, I wanted to take you through the examiner report or the AQA's thing. So the 10 mark here, there's one example that got 3 marks. You can look at that. There's one example that got 6 marks, and then this one got 10 marks, albeit the person wrote quite a lot, and I don't know if I'd write quite as much, but the structure is what I'm looking at. So, sorry, so that was actually for a different paper. So that was for the Boeing and Airbus paper. So the question said, does the data support the view that Boeing has been more successful than Airbus? So let's have a look at the extract together and we'll look at the model answer. So we've got 3 figures. So we're just highlighting 3 or 4 things that we would like to talk about that we think are relevant to the question. So looking at this, we've got the number of deliveries. Boeing always make more deliveries than Airbus, so that could be one suggestion that Boeing are more successful. Boeing seem to have a higher market share every single year. That's another thing that we can write about. And then Boeing had more revenue in pretty much every single year. Okay, and then that's going to form our 3 or 4 paragraphs, and then we've got the limitations to think about as well. Okay, so let's have a look. The answer that got 10 marks says, to consider whether Boeing has been more successful than Airbus, there are several areas which could be assessed. The number of deliveries they made, their market shares, and their revenues. So that's straight out of the data, and that's completely fine. With the macro stability one, we might want to consider our our own reasons before looking at the extra. That's completely fine. In terms of the quantity of deliveries made, the data in extract B figure 1 suggests that Boeing has been more successful. Clear argument, Boeing has been more successful because of the number of deliveries made. Go into the data, say exactly what numbers you're looking at, so be very specific. So I would be like, figure 1 shows that Boeing made more deliveries than Airbus in every year between 2014 and 2018. One example would be that they made 6 more deliveries in 2018. They also made, and then do the maths, 94 more deliveries in 2014. Therefore, the data in extract B would suggest, and this person didn't do the maths, and that's completely fine as well. It's just an easy way to show you understand and are analyzing the data in the right way. That's it. That's all we need for our paragraph. So now it's our however, but remember what we're doing here is we're saying why the data is limited, okay? So the data here is limited because it only shows data for 5 years. However, the data is there is no data for post 2018, which is a significant limitation. And therefore, we can't conclude that Airbus is currently more successful than Boeing. Boeing or whichever, we don't know, right? I think I would keep it as simple as possible. If you wanted to, you could also maybe go into a bit more detail. It doesn't show where the deliveries are, the value of the deliveries, and so on and so on, but I really wouldn't overcomplicate it. Then in terms of market share, again, we can keep it really, really simple. We don't even need to talk about the other bit. We just have to say, year on year, figure 2 also allows us to, leads us to believe, so figure 2 leads us to believe that Boeing is more successful than Airbus, as Boeing has had a higher market share for 5 years running. Example would be that they had 0.3% more market share in 2018. Another example would be that they had 8.2% more market share in 2015. Okay. But again, so this person gave 2 limitations here. They said, but Airbus has seen a significant consistent increase in their market share, 41 to 45. So that's showing that you understand what the story the data is showing. Whereas Boeing has seen a decline by from 47.3% to 45.7%. This implies that the gap is closing. And then he brought it, the student brought it onto their next limitation in the same paragraph, saying that the data is limited by the post 2018 lack of post 2018 data, but they made it even better by showing that they can see the gap is closing. So if you carry on this trend, Airbus are likely to have overtaken Boeing in the coming years. In terms of revenue, they kind of wrapped up the paragraph. You can keep this more concise, it's completely fine, but if you have the time, this is a perfect answer. Therefore, the data gives weak support that Boeing has been more successful since 2014. Again, the limitations, we don't know how the data continued after that, and the fact that the story could suggest the other way around, that Boeing will have been overtaken by Airbus. In terms of revenue and profit, it also suggests that Boeing has been more successful since 2014. Boeing has had more total revenue pretty much every year. You can just pick the most simple example, but if you wanted to go down the route of average revenue, you could say more, less, and more. So then you would say that it's had more average revenue per aircraft in 3 out of the 5 years. The student's answer was, in terms of revenue and profits, figure 3 extract B suggests that Boeing has been more successful in terms of increasing their profit margins from 10.7% to 13%. Airbus has increased at a slower rate from 6.3% to 9%. And then if you can do the percentage change off the percentages, fine. If not, this is clearly good enough, as it got 10 marks. However, Boeing has seen more fluctuations. Okay, so there's a bit of you're understanding why the data is not telling a complete story. It also says that Boeing has been more successful in maintaining average revenue per aircraft down by less than 8% from 2014 to 2018, whereas Airbus has seen a decrease. In conclusion, the data overall supports that Boeing has been more successful. However, the support is weakened by the fact that the data is limited from 2018 onwards, and you can give your own points as well, but it's also not showing whether or not Boeing eventually caught up to whether Airbus eventually caught up to Boeing. So I wanted to look at the 2024 question together. It says, to what extent, if at all, does the data suggest that people living in the southeast are better off than people living in the northeast of England? So I'm going to write my introduction now before reading the extracts, and then we'll look at it together. So I would say something like, the question concerns whether people are better off than another group of people. So I related that to living standards, and I said, so there's a document which has all the economics definitions for AQA. So there's one for standard of living, and it refers to the ability of people to satisfy their needs and wants. It also mentions education and health, but in this case, I said this could be measured by incomes and also other factors. If you want to, you could check the extract, but we're going to be going through that in our paragraphs anyway. Now, when I look through this extract, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 figures. This is good because we can pick our favorite bits, right? So we should kind of make an overall decision before we start. So population, Southeast has a bigger population, and their population is growing every single year pretty much, okay? What can we infer from that? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, we don't actually know, right? Because a higher population could be a good thing or a bad thing. So something like this comes up, I'm skipping it and I'm coming back to it, okay? Now, Figure 2, it clearly shows that unemployment is lower in the southeast than it is in the northeast. Employment is higher in the southeast than the northeast, and economic activity is lower in the southeast as well. Okay. Whichever one you pick, you should be able to describe or define these words. Unemployment rate is just the easiest. So employment is the number of people working. Unemployment is the number of people who are not working out of the people who are trying to find a job. But again, here, definitions are your friend. Okay, so we can go straight into our first paragraph. We don't have to scan the data. We can come back to it for more points. But I think the rough idea is that the southeast is going to clearly be better off. More income here as well, right? Figure 2 could suggest that people living in the southeast are better off than people living in the northeast, as it shows that there is a lower unemployment rate for people aged over 16. Unemployment refers to the number of people willing and able to work who cannot find a job. The data shows that the unemployment rate in the southeast was 3% compared to 4.2% in the northeast. Okay, and now it's our time to explain that the link between the data point and the question. So the lower the rate of unemployment, the more people that are working and earning income. The higher people's incomes are, the more things they can afford, which would allow them to satisfy their needs and wants. Therefore, we can infer that people in the southeast have a better standard of living. Okay. So we said the unemployment bit, we're really just linking it to the words of the question, whether people are better off. Okay. That's it. That gets us our marks for our analysis and all that stuff. We just need to say some limitations. So what was the wording of the question? Whether people are better off. Well, unemployment is not the only factor that determines whether people are better off or not. Unemployment, this is also just showing people aged above 16. Some of the other stuff is also just showing 16 to 64. I would probably just keep it simple and say that unemployment is not the only factor. I could also go down the route of people may be working, but they may be working in high-skilled or low-skilled jobs in different areas, and it doesn't factor in cost of living in the south or the north. So there's quite a bit we can say. I guess some of it will be covered in the other figures. So let's have a quick look at them and then decide. Figure 3 is talking about incomes and GDP. So we might want to save that for later. Figure 4 is showing government spending. And then figure 5 is showing how many people are working in different job types as well as house prices. So that can get confusing for us. So I think our second and third paragraphs will probably be figure 3 and figure 4. We're going to talk about wages here. So we're just going to say it doesn't factor in what type of work people are doing. However, one limitation of using the data in figure 2 is that it shows unemployment rates, but it doesn't show the types of jobs that people are working. For example, unemployment rates may be lower in the southeast, but people may be working part-time jobs or low-skilled jobs. This means that their wages could be low, and therefore their quality of life might be lower. And then rinse and repeat 2 more times. Okay, so for figure 3, we're just going to say Figure 3 can also be used to argue that people living in the southeast are better off than people living in the northeast. Figure 3 shows that GDP per capita, per head, is higher in the southeast than it is in the northeast. It shows that GDP per capita is £34,516 in the southeast compared to £23,109 in the northeast. This means that people are earning more money per person, which implies that they can afford more goods and services to satisfy their needs and wants. One limitation here is that it doesn't show cost of living in these different parts of the UK. The cost of living in the southeast might be higher, therefore GDP per head alone doesn't necessarily show that living in the southeast is definitely better than living in the northeast. Right, and then finally, looking at figure 4, we've got public sector revenue per head, so how much tax people are paying, public sector spending per head, and the net fiscal balance per head. Remember, we've kind of formed this thing that people in the southeast are better off, so we have to stick with that now for our third paragraph. So the easiest way to do it is that, well, we could say that people's incomes are clearly higher and the money that they're spending on goods and services is clearly higher, profits are higher, because that's what causes tax revenue to be higher from business profits, VAT and income tax revenue. But it's also a little bit off-putting the fact that public spending is actually higher per head in the northeast. So we can kind of argue this both ways. I guess that helps us form our limitations. We have got a few more in figure 5. We've got the fact that house prices are considerably higher. Well, that's bad for people trying to buy a home, but it's much better for people who already own a home. And their house prices are not changing as much. So there's a lot of data here that splits judgment, which is fine. We're just going to look for the easiest ones that help us continue to explain why living in the southeast might be better, and then we can go with the limitations. If you have time, you can do 4 paragraphs, which means you can cover 2 more figures. I think we'll keep it simple and say, lastly, figure 5 shows that people in the southeast are likely to be better off than people in the northeast. This is shown as house prices are considerably higher, more than twice as high in the southeast at £402,000 per average home, compared to £163,000 per average home in the northeast. Higher house prices suggest that people living in the southeast are more wealthy, as they own a home that is worth more. This suggests that over their life they've accumulated more income and therefore more wealth, and therefore they are likely to have been able to afford nicer things. One limitation of this data is that it only shows house prices in October 2022, and it also shows that the percentage change in the previous year was 11.6% in the northeast, which is actually higher than the 10% increase in the southeast. This suggests that very slowly the northeast is catching up with the southeast. Overall, I would conclude that living in the southeast is better off than living in the northeast, as there is evidence that shows employment rates, income and house prices are higher in the southeast. However, there is some evidence to suggest that living in the northeast is becoming better. Also, figure 4 shows that people living in the northeast are getting more support as public spending per head is actually higher. This compensates for lower incomes. So you can read this answer later, and I'd obviously recommend reading the AQA one, as it's been marked by marked and annotated by AQA themselves. But I just want to remind you of the overall structure. You've kind of got an introduction where you define or describe the key terms or the key factors needed to answer the question. Filter through the data and come up with your own judgment as to whether you agree or disagree with the question at hand. Give 3 bits of data for why you agree or disagree. Go in one direction and then evaluate by either talking about the limitations of the data or why the data is contradicting, or both. You can find all the questions in the link in the description below, and you can also comment below if you have any more questions.